Hey everybody, welcome to a shiny new episode of Midweek Worship, January 2024. Thanks for tuning in this week, guys. My name is Jeff, and if you don't know who our church is, if you're not familiar with why we do this broadcast called Midweek Worship, would you look below me? Because in the notes to this episode, you'll see a link to a YouTube video. After this is over with, if you check that video out, it'll tell you more about us. It'll tell you more about this broadcast. And we're discussing the sacraments. We're going to talk more about that word today, but we're also going to get into some pretty controversial theology. I mean, over the centuries, the church has been angry with each other on the question that we're going to deal with today. But I want to make sure that our hearts are right before we get into the Bible and before we get into some theology and before I challenge you to put what you hear into practice. So to get our hearts ready for that, I want to take a short break. We're going to show you a music video, one song, and the words for that song are right there on the screen. So why don't you go ahead and turn it up? Why don't you go ahead and follow along with the words on the screen? And then we'll come back and talk about the number of the sacraments. Sing along, will you?
Hey guys, it is such an honor to experience the love of Jesus. We love because He first loved us. So we pray that you experience that love right now where you are, wherever you find yourself, and that love would change your life and help you love others as well.
He is jealous for me. Love's like a hurricane. I am a tree bending beneath the weight of His wind and mercy. When all of a sudden I am unaware of these afflictions eclipsed by glory, and I realize just how beautiful you are and how great your affections are for me. And oh, how He loves us so. Oh, how He loves us. How He loves us so. Inside of my chest, I don't have time to maintain these regrets when I think about the way He loves us. Oh, how He loves us. Oh, how He loves us. Oh, how He loves us.
sustains me for all my life.
Hey guys, thanks for singing along with that song. So as I said, the church has been pretty divided over theology over the course of the last 2,000 years. It breaks my heart how angry Christian leaders get with each other on some of the theological topics. Don't get me wrong, these topics are important and we should spend time hammering them out, but the way that we hammer them out has not always been helpful. In fact, it's been actually pretty ugly from time to time over the years. Well, another one of those very controversial questions that the Big C Church, all Christians, all time, all over the planet, that's what we mean by Big C Church, or Catholic Church, that's what the word Catholic means, universal, all Christians, not Roman Catholic, but the word Catholic. The Catholic Big C Church has wrestled with how many sacraments are there? Now, the number of sacraments is what we're going to talk about today, and you have basically churches that fall in one of two categories. There are those that are very strict and restricted to basically only two, and then there are other churches that are in the ballpark of around 6 to 7 individual sacraments. I'm going to talk about the number today, but not necessarily the individual sacraments that churches argue for. We're going to cover those in detail in just a few moments. The truth about this number is that the argument has been going on for about 2,000 years. In fact, I'll show you a little bit of history today about how this argument has developed. Most church leaders will say in the Old Testament, you have two primary sacraments. Now, let me make sure you understand this word sacrament. It's a Latin phrase, and if you look at the word sacrament, you will see that it's very similar to the word sacred. What those theologians and church leaders said is a sacrament is kind of an external act where what happens inside the soul is visible for people outside of your body. So over the course of the New Testament or the Old Testament, you had two primary ways that this was done. You had circumcision for every male child. It wasn't an option even on the Sabbath. You break the Sabbath. This incident is so important that you do work on the Sabbath and take that 8-year-old or 8-day-old baby boy, like Mary and Joseph did with their baby boy Jesus, to be circumcised on the 8th day. That is a visible sign that they belong to the covenant of God. A second visible sign was Passover in the Old Testament. Very specific rules, and nobody got a pass, like how I did that, pass in Passover. Nobody in Israel got a break. You must celebrate the Passover. You must celebrate it this way, and nobody gets an exception. By the time you get to the New Testament, those two acts kind of have corollaries in the New Testament. Baptism becomes the corollary to circumcision. Now, all God's children are supposed to be baptized, and the Lord's Supper, his last supper before he went to the cross, becomes the replacement for the Passover meal. But this argument started to develop. Well, wait a second. Aren't there other ways that people can see God's grace in your life? I mean, they can see it visibly. And some of the church fathers started to toss this around. Now, one of the earliest church fathers to argue that there's more than just two ways, baptism and the Lord's Supper, was one of my great heroes in the faith. His name is Augustine, the bishop of the Church of Milan, but he was an African priest who eventually became one of the greatest influences on Christianity over the last 2,000 years. Augustine argued that I think there's 5 more ways that God's grace is demonstrated. So Augustine would say there's a total of 7 sacraments. That was the prevailing thought until the Middle Ages, until an Italian bishop by the name of Peter Lombard came along, and Lombard kind of formally argued these are the 7 sacraments, 2 of them that we've already discussed, baptism and the Lord's Supper, and then these other 5, he kind of wrote those in the theology books, and all throughout the Middle Ages, all throughout the Dark Ages, Peter Lombard's argument for 7 sacraments pretty much held in both the Eastern and the Western Church until you get to the 1500s, where a group of religious leaders start to look at the abuses and the scandals in the church and say something's gone wrong. We need to reform the church. And these Protestant reformers start what's called the Reformation, and these reformers, John Calvin, Zwingli, Knox, and others argue, I think they had it right before Augustine. I think there's only 2. And the reformers would argue it's just baptism and the Lord's Supper. Well, we're going to spend the next several weeks discussing what about these other 5? Are these 5 ways that God's grace can be seen by other people in your life? And if you're sitting there scratching your head right now and thinking to yourself, I don't understand why we're even having this conversation, Jeff. In fact, it doesn't really matter to me. Well, it matters to God. It's actually a really big deal to God. Because part of your role here on planet Earth is to live your life in such a way that people see your good deeds and they glorify your Father in heaven. These are Jesus's exact words. They see something in you and they give God the credit for it, saying, that can't be you. That must be God's grace in your life. Well, that was all the way back from the beginning of time. And in fact, last week we talked about the birth of Jesus. We talked about the baptism of Jesus. Or last week in Midweek Worship, we talked about baptism. But 2 weeks ago, we talked about the birth of Jesus at Christmas time. Let me tell you, actually, let me show you from the Bible how God's grace was visible and people could see that there was something about this baby who became a man who eventually died on a cross and gave his life up for our sins. Luke chapter 2 describes Jesus' upbringing this way. Here's Luke chapter 2, verse 40. The boy grew up and became strong, filled with wisdom, and God's grace was upon him. Luke 2, verse 40. Did you notice what the Bible just said? It said that the boy grew up, people noticed that he was taller and that he was more muscular, that he became stronger, but they also noticed that God's grace was on him. This is exactly what that theological word sacrament means. People could see God's grace on Jesus. And not just Jesus, this happens multiple times in the Bible. This happened with the prophet Samuel. This happened with others in the Bible times. They could see that there's something about this one. And I just want to give you a way of thinking through this question about the sacraments. How many sacraments are there? Instead of feeling like this is boring, like it doesn't matter, I want to ask you to chew on what you just heard from the Bible. In fact, I'm going to take it a step further. I'm going to ask you to memorize what you just heard in the Bible. Because every Christian that I know wants that in our lives. They want Luke chapter 2, verse 40 in our lives. I want to grow. I want to become stronger in the faith. I want people to see God's grace on my life. And I hope you do too. So I typically end this broadcast with a challenge to you. It's a question that I just want you to toss around. I want you to answer out loud. If you've got a family and you're watching this, parents, if you've got your children around and they're watching it, I'd love for you guys to discuss this as a family. If you got a small group around that's watching this broadcast, by all means, spend some time talking out loud about this question. I'll even put it on the screens for you. Here it is. What signs demonstrate God's grace in your life? If people were to look at you that didn't know Jesus and they watched the way that you live your life, would they see some things that says, I think there's something different about her. I think there's something unusual, maybe even special about him, and it must be God at work in his life. This isn't an option. I said that already. Jesus expects this of his people when he says that they will see your good deeds and they will glorify your Father in heaven. So what are the signs this week that God's grace is at work in your life? Would you spend a minute talking about that? Thanks for joining me. See you next week. God bless.